Agilent Technologies. We make products for the chemical analysis market, and I'm part of the group that develops all the software data systems for those.
Oh, he wants to get us both on camera,
Yeah.
so yeah, we probably need to stay on the same side. Forgot about that part.
That'll help.
They're throwing twists at us last minute. It's on?
All right.
So we're going to talk about thinking long term, and that's long-term archive strategies again when you're using Alfresco. The first thing that comes up is really why do you need to have a long-term archive strategy? If you're here, obviously you decided that you do. It's really important to address this in the beginning, so that you have a strategy for maintaining these archives over the long term, so that you don't lose that valuable information. And
So, since we're all driven by some regulatory bodies, one of the biggest authorities, the FDA, kind of stipulates that, whenever you're archiving data, that's part of their rules as to that all your archive records, first of all, must be in either in electronic form, they must be complete and accurate, and they must be ready to be reviewable at any moment in time. And typically that time can vary from anywhere from 7 to 10 years, maybe even longer, depending on which customers you speak to. So there are multiple of reasons where, why you would need to archive this kind of information. Then the other is about, really about data explosion, right? I think somebody presented a slide today about 90% of the explosion in the content happened in the last 2 years. It was in the earlier presentation, which is so true, because in the last few years, the amount of explosion that has happened in the content is just unbelievable. So typically, on a day-to-day basis, you really want to see the kind of stuff that you're working on today or in just last few weeks, right? So you want to be able to concentrate on work that you're doing now. And the work that you have done in the past, you don't necessarily want it to be visible in front of you at every moment in time. So you really want that kind of out of the way for the moment. So that's another reason why you would want to think about archiving.
right, so you talk about that data explosion and data loss. I think everybody in this room, when they started their IT career, we were saving data here, right? Everybody? Yeah. This is a sobering thought, right? Anything you put onto one of these is gone. If you didn't have a long-term archive strategy, a media rotation strategy, some form of a long-term durable backup, whether that's on paper at Iron Mountain or often on some other service, those bits are lost forever. They're absolutely irrecoverable. So when we start talking about archiving, the first thing that we really want to talk about is what an archive is. And as Chetan already touched on, and the first characteristic that we've put on an archive is that it's out of the way. It's not in the primary transactional system anymore. It's something that we have, we've stored it, we know where to find it, but it's not affecting the performance of our current running systems. We also might have limited searchability. So an archive may not have all the search dimensions of your live data, but we do need to preserve enough metadata to be able to accurately locate a specific item. And that has some pretty specific meanings for you guys.
So that's right. So as I was mentioning earlier, the FDA stipulates that some of your records must be viewable at a later point in time. That's got sort of many meanings, right? So typically, or these days, hardware systems, software systems have a fairly short life cycle in terms of, especially hardware. And very few years, their hardware becomes completely obsolete. And as far as software systems go, after 8-10 years, they may not be there as well. So apart from being complete, having native data as well as all the metadata associated with it, there are also rules that say that data must be viewable or must be accessible even beyond that 10-year retention time that you might have. And so from that aspect, you may want to find that amount of that data that you had archived 10 years back. So you would base it on some keywords. So for example, in our case, since we deal with chemical analysis or analytical data, it could be related to instruments, it could be related to the techniques that were carried out, or some sample IDs that were sort of stored at that moment in time. So that's where the limited searchability comes into play.
Right, so things like a batch number or a specific experiment or study. For those of you that are in electronic health records, it may come down to an individual identifier for a person. You need to be able to go back and say, I need to see all the archived health records from this individual, regardless of how far back we're searching. Another characteristic of an archive is that it typically has a long retrieval time. Now, that can be on the order of hours if we're using a cloud service. It could be days if we're using a physical storage service like Iron Mountain or somebody like that. And really one of the last things that we have to concern ourselves with is the cost. So because of this data explosion, right, we're dealing with this exponentially increasing amount of information. And it gets very costly to store that. So when we're looking at long-term archiving, we need to be considering how much that's going to cost us to do. And finally, we have to worry about the document fidelity. So we have to make sure that we capture all the information, we capture it correctly and completely. What an archive isn't, and this is really, really important to not confuse these concepts in my opinion, archives are not backups. So if you have a backup strategy and you're doing regular backups, those are not archives. Backups are really designed for short to medium term recovery, for business continuity and those sorts of cases, whereas archives are concerned with long-term preservation, potentially decades or more. Archiving also isn't records management. So records management really addresses the disposition of documents, right? So when we declare something as a record, it may need to be on a legal hold or it may need to be archived as a state, but it doesn't deal with the actual implementation of that archive. So RM can address the what and the when, but it doesn't really talk about the how of an archive. And finally, we want to make sure that our archives are a snapshot of data at a particular point in time. And again, for you guys, that has some pretty specific.
Right. So for us, for this, the decision to when to start archiving is determined by the type of sort of analysis that you're doing, right? So just to give a quick overview of the kind of software systems that we have, when we kind of analyze a sample from an instrument, we gather the raw data or the original data as it came from that hardware. And then we might do some computational algorithms, run it on that data to derive at our result. And then out from that comes out a nice PDF report that somebody who knows how to interpret that can say sign off on that PDF report and say, hey, this is good, I can proceed further. So it depends on the life cycle of our entire process, and that determines that when you should archive. So typically after all these multiple reviews are done on these particular analysis or experiments is really a good time to start thinking about archiving. There are cases where even once you've done that, you're not immediately archiving it, but you're just sort of keeping it there. It's like, for example, if you look at your Gmail, right, they've removed the delete button now. Now they have archive, right? It sort of just says, takes it out of the way, you click on archive, it actually goes in the deleted trash folder, but it's never really deleted out of the system. So that's the same philosophy there. So when you're done, the life cycle in our case sort of determines when to push that archive button.
Right, and then the important thing here is that is a snapshot, right? So we're not actually going to go back, modify that archive, and then put it back in as a new archive. We have to be able to say for certainty that this particular archive represents this data as it was when it was put into the archive. So we have some different drivers for our archiving. It's important to understand why we're doing this. Why we're doing it is going to determine the characteristics of our archiving. A big one, and a really, really big one, is regulatory requirements. If you're subject to things like Sarbanes-Oxley, if you're a large enough company that deal with that, HIPAA or FDA CFR requirements, you certainly have long-term retention that you have to deal with. Some types of business continuity can fall into archiving, and of course we've got things like cultural preservation, historical preservation, which is a fairly common archive use case for Alfresco with some of our museum partners. So we've kind of talked a little bit about what an archive is, what it isn't, and what's driving it. The next step for us is to determine what we actually should be archiving, right? Now, it's very rarely as simple as just a document. I mean, if it is, and that's all you have to do, that's great. But often we have to do a lot more than that. We may have to do document content, metadata, related stuff, version histories, or audit trails. And again, that ties back into the FDA requirements that Agilent has to deal with.
Right. So here again, like you saw, the FDA CFR, that stipulates that whatever analysis you do has to be complete and accurate. What that means is just not your report file that you created, but the original native data from how you deduced those reports or your results also must be archived. So that's really the raw content. Apart from that, if you did any computational analysis on that raw data, the output of that also must be archived. And in addition to that, because we are in a compliance environment, if you need to capture or you need to archive all the activity that was done on those analysis, which is really audit trails, because it gives you a traceability of which user did what at what time. And part of the reason also goes back to the fact that, being in a compliance, you get either audited or there is some lawsuit for some medication 10 years down the line, and you have to go back and actually look at those results back, right? And that's the reason why it's not only one, it has to be the entire package that has to get archived. Okay?
Yeah, so that may be that audit trail is an interesting point. So we need to be able to say for a specific data set who approved it, because that has legal ramifications down the line if it was improperly approved, and we have to be able to capture all of that information. So again, we've defined what an archive is, we've defined our drivers, we know what we're going to archive, and the next step for us is to determine how we're going to prepare it for long-term storage. When we start talking about long-term archiving, the formats, the importance of selecting the right formats for your data cannot be overstated. We want to make sure we have well-defined formats with open specifications, things that have broad vendor support. We want, of course, things that have strong, stable governing bodies. So if you have the opportunity to do an archive to something that's ISO supported or maybe supported by a specific industry organization, right? If you have more vertical specific types of data that you're managing. Those things really matter. And we should always express a preference for something that's human readable. A good example for this might be that, if you looked at some of the news out of NASA recently, they were trying to recover some data from some tapes from the Apollo era. They were able to get the data, but they had absolutely no documentation for what format it was in or how to read it. And if that's the case, you might as well not have it, right? I mean, there's no point in having something that you actually can't use. So with that in mind, we really want to say no to things like single vendor formats, closed specifications. Data that's in a binary only format, if we can at all avoid it. And especially things that may be patent or IP encumbered. So say, for example, a specific file format has some patent encumbrance. It may be possible down the line that it may not only be technically difficult, but it may be legally impossible for you to re-implement that to retrieve your data. So when we start talking about some of the analytical data and what Agilent's doing, there's really a couple of formats that come into mind for them.
Right. So in the case, as I was mentioning earlier, that our entire package has to be complete and accurate because we want to be able, because FDA may want to inspect that, FDA or the auditors may want to inspect that data at a later point in its original software. But if that original software or the data system is not available 15 years down the line, there still has to be a way to get to your results and look at those results later point. So we're also trying to make conscious effort to capture that data either in some emerging standards, like what in our industry what we refer to as the ANML, that is the analytical markup language. And that kind of gives, since it's a standard, or it will be a standard, it's a technology neutral, and we know it's future proof, so that even 20 years down the line, it's an XML after all. You can still read it, you can still view it. There are regulations around what you can view. So, for example, just to give another example, is that you may provide additional viewers that may just be able to just look at your animal, and that may be enough, because all you want to do is just look at the data. Just looking at XML by itself, it can be very esoteric anyway. So, and that's that's one of the pushes that we're trying to do is, apart from native binary packaging, also include other aspects which will stand the test of time.
Right, and in Alfresco, we can implement that as a rendition, right? So we may have a vendor-specific format that is essential for the day-to-day operation of the business, but we can take that and transform it into something that's more suitable for long-term storage. And by using Alfresco content transformers and Alfresco renditions, we can automatically create and maintain those long-term stable versions of content automatically as we go forward. So as Chetan just mentioned, the animal format is an XML format. XML gets a bad rap these days, mostly because of how complex it is to implement as part of an API. But for long-term archiving, XML is a pretty good choice, right? I mean, it's verbose, which is often thought of as a weakness, but in this case, it's a plus, because verbosity also gives us a little bit of descriptiveness that we might not have otherwise. So another thing to be concerned with XML data is the DTD and schema. So we need to be able to verify that these documents are going to be correct, right? And in order to do that, we have to get the schema or the DTD along with it. And again, we want to prefer multi-vendor standards. Another gotcha to watch out for in XML file formats is embedded binary. So some formats, like some of the Microsoft open, so-called open XML Office formats, actually contain binary data that's only readable by their applications. That's hardly a long-term stable solution. Another great choice for long-term storage is PDF. PDF is well supported, it's well documented, it's renderable by a huge variety of tools. And we even have a specific ISO standard around what's called PDFA. Has anybody here ever worked with PDFA before? Yep. So PDFA is basically a subset of the PDF document spec. It tells us about what we can and can't do in a PDF document to make it archive ready. So this includes things like getting rid of linked fonts, getting rid of external, or getting rid of embedded audio and video. We have to do some work with our color space definitions, but the long and the short of it is that there's a bunch of features in PDF that we can't really use if we want to produce a long-term stable document. And PDFA defines what those are for us. So to support that, we've got a really quick demo here of of a PDF archive converter for Alfresco. Is anybody here familiar with the Alfresco PDF toolkit? Anybody? Yeah, you guys have seen it? There's a new cut of that coming out. I'm actually the maintainer of that project. And we've added a new action to the PDF toolkit that allows us to transform documents to PDFA. So what this does is it takes an existing PDF document, it sends it to the Alfresco LibreOffice converter with a few flags set telling us that we're going to output a PDFA doc. Essentially, it's a reprint. So it shows up as a normal action, so you can use it from within content rules, JavaScript, Java, whatever you can call a rule, or an action from rather, you can call this code. We've got an example of it within shares. We can actually call it from a share action, and we can go down to convert to PDFA. We select where we want to put it, whether we want to execute in place or give it a destination folder, and select the PDF compliance level. So there are different compliance levels of the PDF archive spec. We'll just leave it at A1A because that's kind of the simplest. We click OK, and it converts our doc to PDFA. We're running a little bit short, so I don't want to try to run this through a validator to show you, but the long and the short of it is that we can actually take this doc and re-render it as an archive capable, or as a true PDFA archive. Let me get the PowerPoint back. That was a pain to switch back and forth. Okay. So another common set of formats that we have to archive are images, audio, and video. You want to talk a little bit about those ones, right?
Yeah, I think this is probably familiar to everybody, right? So your MP3s, MPEGs, all your most probably WAV files, audio files. Choose the most well-established open formats there are in terms of the rich media formats, and keep it like that so they can be archived. In fact, if you know, you might have read that some of the movie industry, they're taking their old movies from 40s and 50s and tape, are actually converting them to either a WAV file or some other open formats, so that they can be archived for later use. The same is true even for some audio remasterings that they do of old music. They follow the same philosophy, is to convert them to well-known audio formats. So
yeah, and what's nice about that is that for all its faults, digital's stable. It doesn't degrade like a tape or burn up in a warehouse like a celluloid print. So again, we want to look for the most widely supported unencumbered formats that we can find. And if you're looking for guidance in any of these areas around formats for long-term archiving, two great resources for you, and there's links on the last page of the slide for this, is the National Archives of the UK and the US Library of Congress. They actually have done some work to kind of rate the archive readiness of a lot of different file formats, and they have their preferences. And they're very concerned, of course, with long-term preservation.
Even the Library of Congress actually has very interesting read. If you were interested, just look at the Library of Congress website and how they preserve their archives. It's got pretty good information there as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have their budget, but
Yeah.
some of the techniques are still applicable. So we've determined what we're going to archive. We've determined what format we're going to archive it in. And the next step for us is to really look at how we're going to get it exported. It's worth noting that exporting isn't necessary in all cases, right? We don't always have to do this. There are some archive modes, such as archiving to the cloud or archiving to the repository that we'll discuss in a moment, where we don't have to worry about archiving. But if you're going to go to anything that's outside the repository that's file-based, right, you're going to have to worry about some form of an export. Some of the options you have here are ACPs. So the Alfresco content package, people I'm sure have worked with those in the past. At first, that really looks attractive. I mean, it's metadata and structure, all in a well-documented, understood XML format. For small archives, like individual tiny packages, maybe a folder with a few documents in it, that might not be a bad choice. Unfortunately, it does have a size limitation because it is a zip file. And it also gets imported back into the repository as a single transaction. So very large, complex folder structures can cause you problems when you try to re-import this stuff. The bulk export tool is another option. So that's actually an Alfresco community project. It exports content and metadata in a form that's re-importable with the bulk file system import tool. Our download as zip function is another good one. But it suffers from some of the same problems as ACP. It is a zip file, so it has an upper size limit. And it can give you some performance problems on very large archive sets. You may also want to look at a custom action or implementing your own archive service. It's this last one that we're actually pursuing because we have some needs for packaging content that extend beyond what we can do with the download as zip or the ACP functionality. So once we know what we're going to do, we have it exported, we have to also consider ourselves with how to go about packaging it. And this is what we're working on right now on our project.
Right. So the 4 bulleted items you see about document, metadata, audit trail, and related documents, that's extremely important for our kind of use cases. They have to be complete. Otherwise, it's does not deemed as a reusable archive, because one of the things that we really have to consider is reconstitution. So if this archive is exported out of the system at a later point in time, if it's possible, we should be able to read it back in the same application or in the original application and actually view it. So those four items there, they have to be as part of the archive. In addition to that, you could have some technology neutral renditions or transformations of your archive data that will help you to keep your archive truly future-proof.
Right. And the point of the packaging is that we want to make sure that all these things are retrievable as one unit, right? Like we can say we have the audit trail and it's in the live repository and we have the data in the archive, but that's not good enough. We need to have all of those things as a single atomic unit. So when you're thinking about the atomic unit of archiving in our case, it's all of this stuff put together. So we've got our package, right? We've got our archive. We've got our formats decided on. We know what we're gonna archive and why. The next step for us is where we put it. There are a lot of options here, and this is probably where a lot of people get the most value out of archiving, right? So one of the places we could put it is an Inplace Archive. This could take the form of just a content store in Alfresco, right? Like a secondary content store designed for archiving. Alfresco already implements this out of the box with our sort of trash functionality with our own archive store. It's got a few pros and cons. It's easy. It's well supported. It's probably the simplest method for archiving, but it also has a lot of negatives. Because the content is still in the repository, we don't get the performance gain We don't get typically the cost reduction, and we do have some challenges there with regard to indexing it in solar. And of course, our backups don't get any smaller of our transactional system.
And there's also one advantage is that, just like I was mentioning earlier, when you archive, you may just want to keep it there for a few days and go back and review it at a later point soon, maybe in the next 10 to 15 days, and just have so you can keep it locked, right? You can keep it only read-only so that nobody can actually go and modify that data while it's in the transactional system. And then make a decision based on your policies that maybe after 30 days or 1 month or any archives greater than 1 year, you can decide to sort of move it out of the system to reclaim your disk space, keep your system healthy, make sure that your performance doesn't degrade. So those are the various reasons why you might want to export it out.
Right. So we can look at archiving in place kind of archive light. Right. We don't get a lot of the benefits of an actual archive by doing it this way, but it does go very quickly. Another place to archive would be to archive to media. This is what a lot of companies do. If you go talk to, again, I keep bringing them up, but if you go talk to an Iron Mountain about archiving, they may tell you, you're going to go to tape, and we're going to bring a truck, or we're going to pick up your archive tapes, we're going to take them back, we're going to give you a list of record IDs to tell you where to find that stuff. And that's kind of like a really old way of doing it. I mean, I guess with regard to, I know Iron Mountain also sells cloud backup services now. They have a whole modernized suite, but this is, the archive media thing is kind of a way that companies use to manage archives. So of course there's some cons to that. We have to do management and rotation schedules. It can be expensive. It requires preserving both hardware and software if you're going to do it yourself. This again, the NASA example is illustrated. They've had, they have archive tapes. They don't have machines to read anymore, so that can be a really big problem for them. Another possibility is an archive repository. So we could have a separate repository out there, whether that's Alfresco or it could be even an existing ECM repository that you have that you're not using as live data anymore, but it's already in place, it's already paid for, its performance characteristics are well understood, and you'd like to move off to that archive repository. You can already do that with Alfresco to Alfresco transfers. So the replication service can handle creating from an archive repository for you today. Of course, the cons is that if you don't already have one, it can be very expensive to implement. So this is an area also where you guys are investigating.
Well, I mean, it's really made about the point that you mentioned about cost. You already have the infrastructure up and the systems already deployed in your organization, and you may want to consider using that as opposed to completely creating a new system for doing that. So it makes sense in some cases it doesn't. It depends on your particular use cases, what you really want to do with it. There are organizations that just archive and forget about it and maybe look at it only once in a couple of years. So that's just another option.
Right. And of course, an option that a lot of people are considering now is archiving to the cloud. There are a lot of companies out there that do this. We have Amazon AWS with their Glacier product. A lot of the archive vendors that have been in business for a really long time also have very compelling offerings in this area. I think Iron Mountain's one of those as well that does cloud-based or archive as a service almost. The pros of this are cost. It tends to be far less expensive than archiving to media, local repository, or anything else. It's simple, and it does transfer some of the risk to a third party, so you don't have to worry about your people forgetting to maintain the archive, right? You've got trained professionals doing that for you. That is their business. Some of the cons, fear of the cloud. Some people think that there's loss of control, and bandwidth can be a problem for very large archives. And I think in your industry, that fear of the cloud takes a couple of different forms, right?
Right, especially the fact that it's regulated and compliant. So
right.
the data is not within your control. It's somebody else who's managing the data. So there are several aspects of the fear of the cloud that plays
and of course, once you, every time an incident like the recent iCloud breaches happen, that sets everybody a little bit on edge, right? I mean, they see this breach and they get a little more fearful of the cloud itself.
Just to mention a point about the cost, for example, the Glacier, it's like 10 cents per 1 gigabyte per month. That's how cheap it is.
Actually, I think now they've dropped it to 2.
2? Okay, there you go. So
So it gets cheaper every day.
Yeah.
So when we start talking about this, one of the ways that we've explored, just kind of as a thought experiment, is to use AWS Glacier as an archive target. One option would be to do a Glacier direct archiving. So where we have an Alfresco repository, we have an action that actually takes that content, pushes it through the cloud up to a Glacier archive where it's stored in a Glacier vault. This is the simplest model, because all we're doing is we're taking a content item, a file somewhere in the repository, and saying we want to store this off in the cloud somewhere. And we have a real quick demo of an extension that does just that. So as part of the hackathon, we put this together. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at another action within, oh, sorry, it helps I actually change my screen, doesn't it? So we're looking at the same document that we just transformed to PDFA a minute ago. And we have another action within Alfresco called Archive to Glacier. What this does is it actually uses the AWS SDKs, it takes this content and pushes it up to Glacier. And what we get back is a archive ID. Just a moment here. In our node browser. And once we've done the archiving, what we have in our doc is some new information to help locate this. So we have a Glacier archive ID and a Glacier checksum. So the archive ID tells us where to find it in Glacier, and the checksum is just to ensure that the content that Glacier got was actually correct. Nothing was corrupted in transit. We can use this ID to actually request that that document be retrieved fairly easily. So we go back to our same document and we can do request Glacier retrieval. So when we send this request, what we're telling Glacier is, I want you to recover this document for me. I need it back somewhere where I can access it. The problem with Glacier is that there's a 4-hour retrieval time. And I think there may be other services out there from other vendors that have a shorter retrieval. But AWS Glacier, we're looking at a 4-hour SLA. So when we click on request retrieval, we're actually going to send the request up and say, we need a retrieval of this doc. But we might not get it for up to 4 hours. When we do get it, the job status AWS will switch and say that this thing is actually available for download. At that point, it's in S3. We can download it back to the repository and pull it into the repo. So we actually have a retrieve document from Glacier action, but if I click on that right now, it's going to say unable to request retrieval, and the reason being is that it's not there yet. Glacier hasn't actually initiated that operation. Another option that we would have for archiving in the cloud would be if we had Alfresco deployed to the cloud. So if we have Alfresco in AWS already, we're using S3 as a content store. We can set some things, we can use what's called object lifecycle management, which will tell us that content is aged out of S3 as, according to some rules that you've set up. That then ends up in Glacier and goes into an archive. It ends up in a vault, exactly the same as the previous model. And one final model that we have here, but this previous one only works really if you have Alfresco deployed in the cloud already, right? Like you're not going to have a remote content store with an on-premise repo. The performance would just be abysmal. Another option you could use for, though, would be to use Glacier via S3. So in this case, we would have Alfresco on-premise using our content store selector, and we have 2 stores, right? We have a local file content store, which is our operating store, the one we're working in every day. And then we use the content store selector to mark content as moved to the archive, at which point it is pushed up through the internet to S3. Amazon's object lifecycle management kicks in, creates a Glacier archive, and places it into a vault for us. And that's pretty much all we had, so we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. Shoot.
Me?
Yeah.
Can you tell something more about this this plugin or this piece of code that you have for pushing to Glacier? Is it like some custom thing, or would it be available as a module?
Okay, the question was about that Glacier integration.
Yeah.
It's an open source project, so it's a community maintained project. Of course, that means it's unsupported, but you're free to use it, experiment with it, play with it, remix it, hack it, whatever you want.
What is it called? What is the?
It's called Alfresco Glacier Integration, creatively named. And it's actually up on my GitHub account, and there will be a link to that in the last slide. So if you download the slide deck, you'll get a link directly to that extension.
The PDF toolkit, the new release, is it already available?
Oh, which one?
No, for the PDFA.
For PDFA, again, the project is moving from Google Code to GitHub to make it easier for other contributors to work with us, or to work with me on the project. That particular extension right now is in pre-release beta. So there's a beta release that you can pull down ahead. And unfortunately, that feature, by the way, that is an enterprise-only feature. So if you're on Alfresco community, the PDFA doesn't work.
And do we create a rule, convert to PDFA?
You could. You could, or you could call the action from some JavaScript, or you could call it from a web service call. You know, however you want to do it. It's just a simple action. Yeah.
Okay.
Any more? Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.